French Revolution. So when I got my master's degree and my graduate work way back in the 20th century, this was my field of study. My professor was the British history professor, but he loved the French Revolution as I did, and so our focus on the French Revolution. So I find it one of the most important. In fact, I would suggest, and I'll try to make this argument at the very end, there's a sense if you were to ask in 2024 what's been the most important thing in the past 300 years, you'd get obviously a couple of different debates that had the most impact. But I think the French Revolution actually tops the list. We'll try to make an argument for you at the end of our session that calls that into question and raises the question of, well, maybe the American Revolution should be more important, particularly as we're in a seemingly time of some chaos, not just here in our country, but seemingly globally, raising questions ultimately about what makes a thriving society. You know, how do we have a best society flourishing for all people? And the French Revolution, you know, plays an outsized role. It is also my contention, and the way I say it is that poor France is a nation that I've loved and studied, and they have a very long and vibrant history all the way back. When she goes through this, she becomes a shell of herself, and you can sort of see that here, where they have just consistently struggled to find their footing. Now, that raises questions to me not about the French, but about some other aspects, we might say, of a European perspective. And so we'll kind of walk our way through and see what that does. Let's see if this one gets us there. If you missed part one, if you click on that, I learned how to do a little QR code. And thanks, man. We'll see if we can trade those out and see. Ooh, that's even fancier. Upgrade one. And that will get you to my YouTube channel, and then you can watch that later. Don't watch it now, because then you'll be really confused. What we're going to try to do, so here's what happened in part one. In part one, let me just back up and go forward. All right, there we go. Thank you so much. In part one, what we looked at is the background of the revolution. Like, why did it happen? And moved itself through the Constitution of 1791. Now, we trickled on in the very last minutes of that presentation beyond. And it's one of the kind of leading questions that people ask about the French Revolution is like, what happened? And we're going to look at that again at the end of our discussion, our lecture together. Because in 1791, it would appear that they had succeeded. They had shifted from the kind of normative European or global state where you have a power pyramid, my phrase, where there's absolutists at the top, the power is congealed or contained in a very small sector of society. Don't think so much as a person, but think about how government lays out, like where is the contending power. And of course, as you should know, I think it's still true to say for our country, that we chose to separate our powers so that the power of decision would be in more than one location. That was part of what our society set out to do. How can we separate power so that it never congealed again? Right? That was the argument that we were trying to make. And so they seemingly had gotten there, and yet we go on. It doesn't stop here. It doesn't stay here. So just to give you a kind of running back kind of point here, we can see all these things kind of happening as the country was struggling economically. It was struggling to some degree, you might say environmentally. They had a massive famine that kind of ruined things leading into the revolution. And so they had a lot of problems. Their debt grew very large. If you watch the recent Franklin documentary, fictional documentary that was on Apple Plus, they correctly laid that whole thing out, that basically we screwed them, which is why don't ever say France is our longest lasting friend. At best, we're frenemies. We kind of deal with each other. We're both kind of arrogant people. We kind of arrogant nations. We think we're in charge. And they, of course, have the longer history and say, hey, we've been more powerful than you, which, of course, is true. But we're like, yeah, but we saved your butt a couple of times. And so this kind of back and forth between us and France. And if you want to say, well, I thought we were friends, we were until Franklin and Adams and the boys kind of said, yeah, screw you, we want what we want. And it's a longer story about what happened in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. But that contributed to what happened to France. It wasn't the only reason, but it contributed. And so, as I said, with the new constitution, they kind of had copied the British. You'll have a constitutional monarchy. Well, we're good. We're done. But they weren't done. And the reasons they weren't done was because of the chaos that ensued. Now, if you were here the first time, I'm going to explain this if you weren't. One of the key takeaways for me about the French Revolution is that it is a wonderful display for us as to how no one can control the forces of change. Right? You hear this a lot of times. People act as if either they're going to or they want to participate in the leading of a revolution. We should have a revolution. Or they think they can choose somebody who can kind of ride to the rescue and control whatever change they wish. Historically, if you study any people group, you see, nope, that's not how it happens. Because once you unleash forces of change, and I'm not saying you shouldn't unleash forces of change, it's just we should be aware that once they're unleashed, nobody can control them. And the French Revolution does a wonderful job of showing us how the framework of change shifts. So just to make the point, when you start back here with the king, the beginning of the revolution is very simple. And I want to use terms conservative and liberal or radical and progressive, but they're not the best terms, mostly because we have so much baggage with them in 2024. So it's very difficult, and your brain wants to immediately leap to things or people that you think are that. Try to refrain from that. However, the king is the conservative. He wants to conserve what is, while at the same time opening himself up and the nation to some potential new structure. And his opponents, the first and second estates, who were called in the Assembly of Notables, would be more liberal than him, right? So in other words, if you start off and you said, give me the right, left, who's opposing whom? It's the king versus the nobility and the clergy of the first and second estate. So where are the people? Well, they're not involved at all. And then both the king and the first and second estate thought they could use the people as a pawn to win the day, to win the debate. What debate? The debate between them. So the French Revolution, at its start, is a debate between the king, the monarch, and the aristocracy and the clergy with them, the elite. That's the French Revolution. Well, the moment they call for the people and the estates general and bring in the third estate, you can see this moving. Now, the only problem with my slide here is this works better in my classroom where I've got a gigantic whiteboard, because this part here should be there. So just see this is moving this direction. Does that make sense? Yeah. So all along, and I explained this in more detail in the first time we talked about it, events happened that caused the structure to shift. And so the first one's the best example, but all the other events are doing the same thing. You went from who's right, think of a teeter-totter, who's right, who's left, and all of a sudden they added a third person. So it happened to be a group who were to the left or more liberal than the liberals. Who are the liberals? The aristocracy and the clergy, who want change to take power from the king. Does that make sense for everybody? But now you've added a group to the left. They could have added somebody to the right. The king was not a dictator. He was not an evil tyrant, no matter what they said. So they could have gone to the right. They didn't, because the people were included. And the people, well aware of what had happened in England a century before, what had happened in America 10 years before, wanted that. So that's to the left, because that involves the people getting to vote. That involves people having a voice. And neither the king nor the first and second estate wanted that at all. Does that make sense? So you keep walking and you keep moving through time, as we do in the first video of this. You see events happen that then force a change, as to use the Hamilton phrase with Aaron Burr, who's in the room when it happens? Right? Makes sense? If you haven't seen the musical, I suggest you do, but Google that, who's in the room, you'll get a song, you'll get it. Right? Who's there when it happens? Because who's in the room dictates the sides. This is why, if you're in a struggle with your HOA and you're like, I'm just never going back, you've just eliminated your chance to play a role. And your voice disappears. And so the shifting of right, left, or whatever power struggle we're talking about, when you're arguing amongst your little league leaders or your synagogue or whatever group you're involved, if you're not in the room, you don't get to be on the teeter-totter figuring out how we balance this thing. So to the French, a series of events occurred that made them more progressive or more radical in their demands, all the way till we got to here. And then as we left last time, we saw that three quick things happened right about the same time this has passed, and they ended up making terrible decisions that would bring in more controversy and more churn in the mix. They don't allow themselves a chance in 1791 for the dust to settle. All right, everybody with me? So, why is this thing like this? There we go. So, those events, including the decision of Congress, their Congress, to declare war, and the decision of the king to leave, to try to get away. He had been a player, saying, I won't participate. Now, of course, if you're the king, it wasn't a stupid decision, because back to the metaphor I've used, he's not even on the teeter-totter. He's been kicked off. What is right and left is way over here, and he's over here finding out events are now being dictated to him. And he's not unaware that there are some people who would pursue his death. So he's kind of like, maybe I shouldn't stick around. Just thinking, maybe I should leave. And he almost pulls it off. He pulls it off, it's a different story. It's amazing how history sometimes hinges and swings on just one brief little moment. But he doesn't pull it off, doesn't make it away. And so out of the fact that he fled, he's put on trial. When he's put on trial, this strengthens those who are on the extreme of radical change from where we had been, and weakens those who had wanted to have a mod. In other words, by the time you get to here, the aristocracy, the clergy, the king, the more conservative members of the people who had come in the third estate, they're off the teeter-totter also. Again, not good or bad, it's just the events had moved to where what was right and left. The conservatives in 1791 had been the radicals in 1788. But now things had moved past them. Does that make sense? Okay. So, he is put on trial. It's pretty easy. He's declared guilty. I think it's pretty obvious. Then it's like, what do we do with him? And there was a debate between the then moderate conservatives these are all, would have been radical in 1787, or all on the liberal side. What do we do? And there's a battle you can see over whether we should kill him or not kill him. I know for us, well, probably most of us feel like, well, of course, I don't want somebody to die, and many of us may have problems with the death penalty kind of thing. But there's another aspect of the fact of who it was being executed that I think misses for most of us, because we don't live in a society with a king. And we sometimes look at what the British are doing with a little bemusement, and we'll watch the 10 hours of King Charles's, coronation, and we're like, that's cute. Look, he's getting dressed up like he's a D&D character, and he's got the robes of this. It's either that or a Monty Python skit, right? He's got the robes of this and the gloves of that. You kept waiting for the holy hand grenade to come out. And we like it. We're like, that's so cute. That's awesome. But, there's not necessarily, I wonder sometimes these days, a desire for us to have a king. But to kill a king is not to say we're killing this lead criminal. It was really putting to death everything about what France meant to that point. Right? Again, we go, what? Sort of the same thing with the Tea Party. We're like, okay, we busted up your tea. Chill out. To attack a product or a thing that belonged to the king. Remember the Robin Hood story? You can't hunt for the deer in the king's forest. We're like, we're all kind of hungry, shooting a deer. Back off. But to kill a deer that belonged to the king, to destroy tea that belonged to the king, would be as if you were destroying the monarchy itself. You were making an open attack on the monarchy. And again, for us, we're like, whatever. But nonetheless, you have to see it from their point of view contextually, that was a massive, massive move. So they did it, and it shocked everybody. And you could arguably say this decision in January of 93 is one of the reasons why the rest of the Europeans, and certainly all the leaders, but the rest of the Europeans and even the people rarely were willing to openly support France. If you take this study, which we won't today, through the rest of the Napoleonic years, there's a moment where you could say, if what the French were proposing was that appealing, then there would have been no more war, because the totality of the people, sure, not the czar, not the emperor, not the kings, but the totality of the people would have rose once they had been freed by Napoleon and his French troops. And that had been the end of the story. We'd all just gone home happy. And yet that's not what you see. You don't have that story. So again, it just raises questions for us as we go through. And I think it's the fact that the king's execution, because it was such a direct attack on everything we've known, you might even say to be European at that point, is attacked. So then this leads to the coming of what will be the wars. Now again, if you study French Revolutionary history, you typically do the French Revolution up to Napoleon, and then there's a whole study of the Napoleonic Wars. And for me, they're just one big series of wars. Napoleon will have his role to play, particularly once 1803 hits, but you generally just have a consistent sense of war. That's why in 1815, the British, even after they had really not been successful in invading the United States as they had planned, coming down from Lake Champlain, or sure they burned the Capitol, but they failed at taking Baltimore, they failed at taking North. They're like, yeah, the heck with this. Because they've been fighting wars for over 20 years. And they were exhausted from war. So we don't want to do this anymore. So you start seeing, and there is a whole study which we won't go into about the military side of things. Well, I'm going to show you some of the military stuff just because you can understand it. That there begins to be a series of what are called coalitions. Think of them as early NATO, or the early Allies, if you want to take a World War II perspective. Who's fighting the bad guy? Who's the bad guy? The French. The French are the bad guys because they're seeking to expand their reach. And so they want to set things right. And so that leads to a whole problem. But there's another problem for France, and that other problem is the fact that they are having a civil war inside. The majority of the French people, or not majority, a significant percentage of the French people were concerned to being unhappy with what was happening to their country. Now, it's not correct to say most of them would be royalists, wanting to somehow re-establish the monarchy, but it is saying that as they looked at the changes that were being proposed and in some cases enacted, they looked at it with fear. Don't be surprised in our own day when, if you listen well to the sides that we have, there's at least two, it could be 3 or 4 sides, when people are using existential language. And don't demean the viewpoint of a person just because you disagree with their perspective. Because for them, it feels existential. And if you take a society to the place where your only options are submit or die, a lot of people are like, okay, well, heck, I guess we just go to war then. So that's where these people were. They perceived what was coming from Paris. So this also plays a role. We talked about this in the first part of the series, is that when you look at the characters, if we were doing a play, of course you'd have the king. Well, now you wouldn't, he'd have left the stage. But you'd have the king. You'd have somebody representing, say, the aristocracy and the clergy. You'd have a representation of the people. But there's another character in the play which cannot be missed in French history, and that is Paris. Paris herself is a role player in the story. And if you study French history going all the way back to the coming of the Franks, you see this played out, in which this land, which today we call France, but this just western part of Europe, has always been in a contest or a struggle over who will have the most power. The lands around this is Old Gaul, so the lands around the outer edges of Old Gaul, Brittany, Normandy, down here, the Provence, Marseille, or Paris. And if you just look at the last 20 years and you examine some of the riots and challenges they've had civically, and you go into the details of it, what you'll find is it's Paris versus the rest of France over what should be done about economic rules and this kind of stuff. So this is something that the new leaders are having to confront with. And so into this, Parisians rise up, leaders to some degree from the new Congress, but others in Paris, and they basically demand a new constitution. So you're like, wait, we just got the last constitution finished. Why do you have to do it? Now, so I've showed you this. We're going to see this slide multiple times. This is to make my point of how the French and the French Revolution is consistently uncertain. Again, people sometimes say, and I'll bring this up at the end, well, why did the Americans become so successful? Well, we only overturned our government twice. The initial getting rid of the monarch, and then we wrote a constitution. We talked about it on our civic days when we do lectures on civics, the Articles of Confederation. And then 7 years later, we got rid of it. And the argument then made by the supporters of men like John Hancock Sam Adams, rock stars of the revolution. They're like, what are you doing? They're looking at Madison, who to them is just some dumb kid. Like, what are you doing? And their argument, simplified, would be, give it a chance. We've just been doing it for 6 years. And the Articles of Confederation was a holistically Lockean document, and they were defending what they saw as the ethos of the Declaration of Independence. And if you move to give power back to somebody like an executive and like a president, we might as well have a monarchy. Madison, Hamilton, the others argued, no, we think we can make it without getting there. But that was the debate. Well, here, they don't even give it 7 years. They're making this change. So the upheaval kind of steps in, and you can see now. Now, some of these aren't constitutions, but I have them listed for you so you can say to yourself, who was running the country? So today we would say, what runs the country? The Constitution. And we've had it for 230-something years. And before that, who ran the country? The Articles of Confederation. Before that, who ran the country? King and Parliament. So we've had 3 groups run the country. The country, only 2 groups, of course. But you get my picture, right? See what I'm saying? So you have these different groups. So I'm going to show you this slide more than once, just so you can get it. Well, this is the most radical of the constitutions. This is the one where they push it all the way. They change the name of the days. They decide 7 days doesn't work, we're going to go to 10 days. This is all connected to their viewpoint of trying to align themselves with what they understood the Enlightenment stood for. An idea of rationality, of reason, that the human did not have to arbitrarily go, oh, well, 1 month's got 30, one's got 31, and one's got 28. No, we can fix all that. We can use reason and count the minutes and divide, and we'll get there, and we'll make these changes. Right? Now, again, maybe that's a great idea. Maybe we are still the bumpkins because we won't leave and go to the metric system. But notice what they're doing. Same thing with cutting off the king's head. Everything that was before, we're eliminating. Now, if you're on the side going, yes, revolution, then you don't care maybe. Maybe you're good. I'll start learning all the new names for the 10 days of the week. I'm good. But if you're somebody who thought, wait a minute, I was born on a Wednesday. I like Wednesday. I like the word July, right? If you're someone who at least is nervous about these supposed promises of utopia, then it'll be better over there. Just trust me. Vote for me. It'll be better over there. You're like, not so sure. Can you see how people would push back against these radical changes? It's important to note one of the things that they do. Now, the revolution already started down this road, but they basically fully eliminate the Catholic Church. Again, you and I don't have to be Catholics or don't have to be supporters of the Catholic Church, but think of a people in a certain place having a certain foundation, and critical to their view of a good foundation was a morality and virtue connected to a specific ideology. And now this group of people come along and say, yeah, we're taking away all that stuff. Again, the Civil War part really growing in the process. It's also going to be interesting. Pay attention to this as we go along. Open democracy, that was their idea. We want to go open democracy. They're going to quickly shift past this and go to anarchy, but for now, open democracy. If we thought people liked to vote, that's the story we tell ourselves today, as we tell ourselves when we go to other nations. Oh, people want to vote. In some cases, we do see that. Many of us remember what happened in Iraq when they had some of their first voting and they got their little ink on their fingers. And that was celebratory, really. If people like to vote, when they get this opportunity, we're going to see like 80, 90% voting. Pay attention, because it's not going to go that way. All right. So they're in the Lord's war. They're fighting for their lives. So here again, we keep moving. Because now we left this Constitution. Now we're over here. But these guys don't stay long because the chaos makes it so that a dictatorial power group takes over in the Committee of Public Safety. It's not appropriate to say the Committee of Public Safety was like the executive branch of their Constitution. That's not the case. But it is appropriate to say that they basically took over. So back to my list, I think I'll show you in a second, you'll see them listed. So you go from saying we're going to have a new Constitution, the old one's not really even inked-dry, but we're going to have a new one, and it's going to be more democratic. Okay, well that sounds good. And it wasn't even finished before this group of people, led by Robespierre and others, took over and said, no, we're going to be the ones calling the shot. So they basically put the new Constitution that they'd written on hold, and they just never really came back to it at all. So the Committee of Public Safety takes over. And this is where we begin getting our way to Dr. Guillotine's tool of doing, again, enlightenment thinking. How can we make executions as rational as possible? Because you ain't never feeling that sucker. You may be nervous getting laid down. You may be wetting yourself and being sad, but then it's over. You're not feeling it, as opposed to somebody chopping your head off with an axe, or somebody shooting you, or in our day, somebody injecting something in your body. Well, the guillotine is a rational enlightenment tool. So they'll roll that bad boy out, and they're going to kick it into high gear with this, because this small group, as often is the case once they had taken power, become fearful of protecting their power. And throughout history, how do you protect your power? You eliminate everybody else. You eliminate anybody who's a threat. Again, what the Americans do when Adams loses the election to Jefferson, there is a peaceful transfer of power, which we pulled off most of the time. But not here. Because, and it's not just the French. Again, you see this in lots of places. Octavian takes over, and one of the first things he does is kill anybody he thought was a threat. Because then you eliminate the threat. Then you have no more chaos. It'd be easy to do. Once you do it, you don't have to worry about somebody mouthing off. And you don't put them in prison, you get rid of them. You eliminate them totally. So there's no room for them to argue. Then they go after Marie Antoinette because she's an easy target, and they go after her. So they execute her, but then they start turning on themselves. So again, the people that are seen up here on the slide are all people who have been radical revolutionaries. But now, since now they're the only ones on the teeter-totter, they're the only ones on the seesaw, somebody's on the right and somebody's on the left. And for the Committee of Public Safety and for Robespierre and his boys, they now perceived our threat is from this group. And they could point to them and say, hey, many of you voted to not execute the king. Remember, everybody voted to get rid of the king. He was guilty. But when it came to the executing part, and they began looking back at writings. And you can see some of the key revolutionaries. If you really study, there's a few women up here who are really crucial to the advancing of the early stage of the revolution. Every one of them murdered. And so this kicks off what's known as the Terror. And you can see the sheer numbers of people who were executed in less than a year. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not a unique thing to the French, but it's a potential within everybody. And if you say, well, why wouldn't I wouldn't support that. You might be one of the people getting rolled up into the guillotine, so you might keep your mouth shut, just like people did in the Eastern Bloc during the hard days of the control of the USSR, because you never knew who was listening. And so some people were brave, and other people said, I'd like to stay alive, and so they keep their mouth shut. Maybe we can condemn them late, just like we do when we look at France in the time of Vichy. Why didn't you stand up and do something? We like to talk about the underground and the freedom fighters in France. You know, there were no freedom fighters in France until late 43. Why? Because they didn't know we were coming to save them. And they kept their mouths shut. Then all of a sudden they were saying stuff. And it was easy for de Gaulle to make claims, but where was his butt? He was over in London, so there was no threat to him. So it's very, I mean, we certainly want to celebrate those men and women in France, for instance, who did rise up and begin to be, you know, under the ground fighters against the control of the Nazis in France. But it just, you and I have to just look at the evidence and say, notice how they didn't really do anything till late 43. All right, so that's, you know, I'd probably be one of them too, doing nothing. So, this all goes on, and I like John Adams, some of you know that. So as this is going on, Adams was quick to jump in here and point out, and he blames Franklin. Now, he and Franklin are not friends. The show does a good job of showing you that. And he's noting how Franklin had been a fan of the French. Now, what he's really arguing against here is Jefferson, but he's choosing not to say it. And he makes the statement that he makes. And he's basically saying, I told you. The French Revolution will not be like our revolution. Now, we'll come back to that later as to the why. But he's calling out what you're seeing. Again, supposedly, liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood. And that's not what you're getting. And again, they're not killing the royals. They're already gone. They're killing within the revolutionary circle. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we've moved further all the way to the chair. So we could keep descending into the chaos, but something happens. While the Civil War is happening, and you have these tensions that are going on, of course, this is not helping. This is where we get Napoleon to join our story. He's just a lowly military leader who's getting involved, but he had the insight to help successfully conquer the city of Toulon, which is one of the key ports for the Mediterranean fleet in France. So he successfully kind of helps. He gets a little notoriety from that. He'll eventually make his way to Paris and become a little well known in the process. But you can see again, even in the Civil War itself, there's more executions that are going on, and that's just in the Vendée. So that's on the kind of the west coast of France in that process. And again, this is a map. There's the Vendée, where this is kind of happening. Now, obviously, just so you notice, Royalist immigrants, British right here, British right here. So the British are trying to find ways to help the Civil War. It doesn't last very well, but that's what they're trying to pull that off. But then in the middle of everything, in Paris itself, something happens. Robespierre comes into another meeting of the kind of public safety group, makes a speech pointing out, now remember, we've already killed tens of thousands of people who would have been there. So you're almost at the point where the only people in the room would have been people 2 months before who were on his team. Like there's nobody in the room but people on his team. He pretty much killed or run off anybody on the revolutionary group, but they were not on his team. Does that make sense? But he still comes in, I got a list. I know who's in there. He starts naming names. And one of these guys, who's on his team, jumps up. Now, typically when this had happened before, they got shouted down and often got ushered out of the room and pretty much went straight to the guillotine. But this time, people around him rose up. So you get this shouting match thing that happens to the point that Robespierre starts going, oh wait, I may be losing the numbers here, so he leaves. Now, it's not clear what's going to happen next. He goes to his headquarters. He's joined by some military people. The National Guard is really the Parisian army. And so they are thinking, tomorrow we're going to do this and this and this. Well, the other guys jumped the gun, and they sent some of their military guys in to the hotel where they were, and they capture Robespierre and the other guys with him. And this is known as the Thermidorian, because that's the word they replaced July with. Thermidor is the month of July. The Thermidorian reaction. They react against, they put him on trial, they come back, so now they've ousted anybody who supported Robespierre. The very next day, they put him on trial again, a totally sham mock trial, not a real trial with justice. And they convict him and a group of his other followers. They're like, you guys are all out, and they roll him out to the guillotine, chop off heads. And so now all of a sudden, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to have this situation whereby, where now you don't have the leader. So who is leading the country? The Committee of Public Safety. Well, now they're all dead. So now who's leading the country? I don't know. We have to figure out what to do. So again, we're going to have a turnover in government as to who's going to be in charge of the story. And so as an example of that, let me show you what happens here on my little slide. For me, it's a good way to see the visual of what happens. Again, Committee of Public Safety stripped of its powers because they're all dead. And so look, then it's hard to see. You'll see in our next coming slide. We hit a wall. So think about this moving this direction. So the revolution, I'll go the same way this one. The revolution is going in a direction. And what was before conservative gets bumped off. It get kicked off the teeter-totter. They're no longer in the room where it's happening. But that keeps moving as more and more events are moving. And they keep going. Now, where are they going to go? Well, we don't know. In general terms, we would say we would hope, for France's sake, they would finally settle somewhere. It's kind of like, remember the snow globes? When some of us were kids, right? You shake those things so you can see the snow go around, the little stuff going around. And then what do? You set it down. And what happens? Eventually it settles. You can see a little snowman, a little castle, whatever's inside your snow globe. It just all settles. But if you just keep circling it, well, we would hope they would settle. But they haven't before they, bam, hit the wall. And now body in motion stays in motion until something acts upon it. They've hit a wall. And now where are we going to go? We're going to go completely the opposite direction. So if they've been going radical, now we're going to go the other direction. So again, we're wondering, well, was it going to settle? Are they going to get settled? Sad news, spoiler alert, they're not. So what happens? Well, first of all, there's payback. The terror continues. This is known as the White Terror. But basically, it's like, hey, payback's Well, you know the rest of it. You're getting yours. Now, they weren't quite as vicious. They didn't kill quite as many people. I don't know that that's something we can say to their nobility, to their good-heartedness. Maybe they just couldn't find people. But you can see, once you unleash this idea of murder as a tool in politics, this is one of the key reasons the Roman Republic falls before Octavian, is that they made murder a political action. That theoretically was seemingly supported by the people of Rome. So now they've made that murder, and that murder continues with payback out in those regions where the Civil War had been fighting. So they got to have a solution, but they don't have a solution in all of the key things that had caused the controversy back in 1785, 86, 87, leading to the king saying, hey, I'll make a few changes, let's call for some help. Those all still exist. And in fact, they've been exacerbated, particularly because of the war. The war continues because these European powers largely feel threatened. Some of them want payback themselves. Remember, Marie Antoinette was a daughter of the most powerful house in Europe, the Habsburgs, who was still at this point, although it's really fractured by now, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, ergo the emperor, loosely stated, of Europe. You killed my daughter. Oh, we're coming for you. Now, unfortunately for the Austrians, it'll turn out on the field of battle, they will not be very good. So they will not be able to pull off their threats. But nonetheless, why don't they just let it go? And again, you and I could say, why don't they just embrace the revolutionary thoughts? Well, in this case, they're like, no, we don't think those are good revolutionary thoughts. Look at the murder you guys have been doing. Almost 1 million people now are getting murdered. Why would we want that here? And so those are the kind of questions that they're confronting. And of course, they're going to try to come up with a new constitution. So they bring back the guys who are in the National Convention who had written the Democratic Constitution. They go, hey dudes, try again. Let's not go quite as crazy. Maybe we should put the names of the dates back to the ones we all know. Let's just go back to July. They won't do that. They will keep the new names for the months. They do go back to a 7-day week. I think they go back here at this point to a 7-day week. So they'll create a new constitution. When you say year 3, what's going on? They're thinking to 1791 with the coming of the Constitution. That's like the year of the beginning of time, which that's not arrogant at all. Maybe a little bit, but then, historically you'll see that a lot. What year is it? It's the 3rd year of this king's reign. So, okay. I'm glad we don't do that because we change ours 4 or 8 years and it's going to be annoying trying to figure out what year it was. So here's our group. Here's our list. There's the Committee of Public Safety. Right? Okay. So, come on, thingy. What am I thinking not working? What they do? This one's the closest to the United States. You can kind of get the sense where the people in the room are saying, all right, we've had a little chaos. Maybe we should look across the ocean. A lot of us were inspired by the Americans. Let's do what they did. And so they come the closest to setting up a system that mimics our republic. They choose for the executive branch, though, a thing called the Directory. So this is kind of leaning into the Romans. They're going to go further to the Romans in just a minute. But the idea the Romans in the Roman Republic had a two-headed, the Spartans did the same thing, a two-headed executive. A lot of debate as to whether or not that's a good idea or not. Don't think of it as president and vice president. These are 2 co-equal leaders, or in their case, 5 co-equal leaders. They were designed. You don't hear me telling you a lot about these constitutions because none of them stay long enough to see if it worked or not. So it's really difficult to see, well, was that a good idea or not a good idea? So they'll put this in motion. Now this, amongst historians, and to some degree the French themselves, was never really referred to as the Constitution of Year 3, but it was always referred to as the Directory. So the Directory becomes this type of name of the government who's kind of running the show. The problem for the Directory, being kind of the American Republic, is now they found themselves surrounded on both sides. In other words, they're trying to stand in the middle of the teeter-totter. And neither group, so the more revolutionary-minded people, the Jacobins still exist, but there's other groups who, I don't want the king, I don't think I want this either, I still want us to be, how revolutionary can we be? And then there is a growing number of, some of the nobility have come back. So you start having people come back in, they're known as the émigrés. They start coming into the country. There are some royalists There are others who are just more conservative. So the directory finds itself beset on both sides. Now again, one of the key things for France is that they can't get out of the war. So the war itself doesn't end, and because it doesn't end, they're in this setting where it's like they have to deal with that crisis. Remember George Washington, when he refused war in 1792 and proclaimed the Neutrality Act with Britain, and all hell broke loose with Jefferson's Republicans, he said famously, look, we're just trying to get started. And he said, if you could give it 20 years, I think we might be large enough to survive a war. Well, 92 plus 20, 1812. And it turned out we were only barely enough to survive that war in the process. So he's got all this kind of negative sentiment that they're confronting. And they're going to find that the people are less and less and less interested in supporting new governments. So there's an election. They decided what they were going to do. Let me go back. The 2/3 law here was that they said the elected leaders had to have served. Now, that plays back to where the 1791 convention was, because when they wrote the 1791 Constitution, they said anybody who had been in the group that created the Constitution could not serve. So again, one of the telling moments, imagine us saying to men like Jefferson or Washington, you can't be in our new government because you helped write the thing. Right? We're like, well, that's dumb. Particularly if you have a people who may not, like the French, have enough experience in doing civic government. Wouldn't you want the ones who had at least a couple of years of practice? So now, here, they're like, yeah, we need to fix that. But notice what happened. Most of those people, they're like, yeah, I'm not getting my head up in there. I'm not standing up above the crowd. Guillotine is still around. I don't want to be involved in this. So you start having less people involved, and that idea of the law was criticized from both sides. So then you get an open kind of opposition that occurs here, where somewhere between 15 and 25,000 Parisians begin to march in the streets. If you've seen Les Mis, you know part of the whole story in the play, which is true history. We're counting on the people to rise. And that's, of course, in the 1830s, people don't rise. Well, part of the reason people don't rise in Les Mis is because what happens here. Because the government knows it's in trouble. It does not have enough troops to fight this fight. And up to this moment, anytime Paris, remember our character on the stage, anytime Paris kind of, I got something to say, that changed the storyline, right? So it's going to play a role here. But Napoleon's in town. And so the guys who are in charge, they're like, tell you what, we need to make sure that Napoleon, he's an actual military leader, he's in charge. And Napoleon is looking for an opportunity. He's like, all right. And he basically gets agreement. Can I do what I need to do? And they're like, yes, defend us. It's a crucial change from everything that happened before. This is his first connection with Monarch, which if you know Napoleonic military history, becomes a crucial player in Napoleon's story. He says to Monarch, look, there's a camp outside. They got some cannons. Go get them. Bring them back. If anybody gets in your way, kill them. So you can get the tone already of how Napoleon's thinking about this thing and where the revolutionary leadership is going. The directory's all in. Yep, do what you got to do. So he does. So he sets up his army in his places of halting, trying to stop. Remember, think of Orlando. If there was open rioting in Orlando is not a gigantic town, particularly not Orlando, proper. But you'd have to. Where am I going to defend? Church Street? Am I on Orange? Am I near Lake Eola? Am I over by the Citrus Bowl? Where should I put my troops? Particularly if you got 5,000-6,000 troops and you got 30,000 to 50,000 people coming at you. Where are they going to be? So Napoleon correctly notes some of the key choke points and sets his troops in motion. And they try to negotiate. They try to figure their way out. But nonetheless, at some point, negotiations break down, and this mob, the Parisians, come after the directory. We're going to get rid of this new government, and we want to get what we want to get. They roll into one of Napoleon's chief defended spots where he had his cannons. Now, if you know anything about cannons, cannons typically, you may have seen this in some movies, shoot out big round balls. It's kind of like a big fat bullet. That's the normal thing you see being thrown out at people. They have a couple other weapons. One of them is they can shoot out what's the equivalent of like a bomb that kind of blows up in the air. And they did have what we call mortars, that an initial, which basically doesn't shoot at you, but shoots in the air, so the thing comes down and blows up above you. But when they knew they were facing infantry head on, they didn't use this often. They had another thing that was called a canister. And if you can imagine a can about yay high, cylindrical like a cannon tube, shoved into it with a whole manner of small little balls like would come out of a rifle. And in some cases under duress, pieces of glass, nails, anything that could be a projectile that would have a sharp end to it, shoved into a cannon. This was sometimes, because again, think of all the little tiny balls, was called grape shot. And it would only be good for a short distance. I mean, if you tried to shoot at somebody, say 300 or 400 yards away, it wouldn't do anything. But it's like a gigantic shotgun. We've all kind of know what a shotgun does. It shoots a series of small balls that go out and hit what it's trying to hit. So Napoleon had his troops wait and wait and wait till the Parisians got very close. Remember, these people have never experienced the government shooting at them because the government had traditionally just backed down in deference to the people. And you can see Napoleon's view of that. He's like, yeah, no, that does not work. Napoleon's thinking, I ain't dying today because you got some revolutionary ideas about rationality. And so he fires on the people. And that's what he came to call, and other preachers began to call, the whiff of grape shot. And immediately the people, obviously, ran for their lives. And upon running for their lives, the threat to the government breaks down. Now, it's not the total end of the threat to the government, but when you start seeing me tell you that both you have more and more moments when people will not vote, and you have more and more moments when, even though there are some uprisings, the people don't rise, like Les Mis, now you know why. It's Napoleon and the whiff of grape shot, which successfully kind of gets there. His reward is he's given the army of Italy to deal with the Italians. So now you can see we're moving back. Now we're not even going to talk to these people. We're going to fire on these people. Now we're headed this other direction. The war does go on. Napoleon, it turns out, is really good as a military leader and is successful against the Austrians. Kind of helps that the Austrians aren't really all that skilled in military. If you're ranking, you get to pick a game and you're going to pick a team to beat. Don't pick the Austrians. Their military is not as good. Pick the Prussians, pick the French, pick the Russians. And he's successful, and by the spring of 97, he basically takes over ruling the Italian peninsula. Now, there's a long history of France and the Italian peninsula, which we won't get into, but many French people would tell you that the peninsula ought to be a mere extenuation of France itself. So for the French, this is a normal thing. They did not ask the Italians, though, how they thought about it. And so the Italians had a very different view at this point in time. It's no longer the time of the Republic or the Empire in which both Old Gaul and the peninsula are governed by the same person. So now there's this growing tension still. So they're having some success on the battlefield, but there's still kind of a growing tension as to what's going on. And so there's this problem that's arising for the Directory. The Directory is facing pressure through the story from both sides. And there will be a series, and we'll skip ahead here, there will be a series of coups against them. Fructidor is the name for September. Floreal, that one you can kind of see. Floreal, well, this one too. Fruit, get fruit, harvest. Floreal, we get flowers in May. And one is coming from, you'd say basically from the right, this is royalists. One's coming from the left, this is the Jacobins. And they're basically going, but again, look what's happening. People not rising, elections, nobody's coming out to vote. So they're dodging these tensions. Now what this is doing is this is awakening in the minds of some of the other leaders that perhaps this Directory is still not going to be solid enough. Do you remember we talked about this? One of the key leaders way back, we talked about this in the first time I did it, I haven't mentioned his name today. One of the key leaders way back at the beginning of our story was a religious leader known as Abbe Sieyès. He was an abbot, and his last name is Sieyès. One of the key thinkers and writers of what it means to even say there's a third estate, the group of the people. Well, during the terror and the chaos, he kind of vanished. But now that they've hit the wall and come back, he's now re-emerging. He's showing back up and having an opinion and starting to kind of participate. And he's noticing, even though we're having this movement away from the chaos, we're still having chaos. So we may have a problem. Now again, the war's going okay. And in fact, there's a moment where it looks like maybe none of this will matter because Napoleon seems to be unstoppable. And then he decides to take the battle to the British. He can't make a direct invasion to England. So what he's going to do instead is attack their holdings near Egypt. He's going to go after the Suez. So he does. If you get to study more British or naval history or French history, you'll run into Horatio Nelson and how even though the British could not successfully fight on the continent as of yet, they still were the supreme power at sea, though there's some dicey moments because the French were going to soon control the Spanish Navy, and the two of them combined. There's a lot more to it. The British Navy was actually quite superior to the French Navy. I love this little story here. Napoleon and the French Navy set out here. Here, let me show you this map here. Actually, we'll go and come back. I'll come back to this, I promise. They set out here from Toulon, and they set out, and they sail, and they land here at Malta, and they get there. The British know what's happening, and so Admiral Nelson is looking for them. He wants to catch them at sea. He doesn't necessarily care about Napoleon necessarily. Obviously changes the whole story if he did. And he goes sailing. The British fleet was so advanced technologically, as well as in their ability, their fighting prowess. A battle between the French and the British fleet wouldn't have been much, as Nelson will show later when he takes on both the French and the Spanish fleet and wins. So Nelson sails up to Marseille and the fleet's not there. He's like, well, they must have left and they're obviously going over here. So he takes off and sails, and the British ships are so fast, they pass the French fleet and they get to Egypt while the French fleet's still out here. Nelson shows up and he's like, was I wrong? Were they going out the Atlantic? Oh shoot, they're headed for Gibraltar. So he turns tail and sails this way. Meanwhile, the French fleet just kind of slowly arrives down in Alexandria. Napoleon offloads, wins some battles. Nelson's like, well, they're not at Gibraltar. So he turns tail, comes all the way back around, and finally catches them. The French fleet has set itself up in a little protective kind of formation, which is great at one level, but in general terms, when you're dealing with ships of sail, they are hampered when they're not moving. And so Nelson rolls in and he goes, oh man, this is going to be good. And they obliterated the French fleet. It's from this battle where his famous ship later, the HMS Victory, comes, because when he looked at, surveyed the damage, he said the word victory is not strong enough to express what we've done here this day. So now Napoleon's trapped, which is back over here on this side. So they get destroyed at the fleet outside of Alexandria. Napoleon is now off fighting. He's having success, but the fact that he's had success has alerted another enemy, the Ottoman Empire. So they're like, whoa, what are y'all doing over here? We don't want you in our neck of the woods. And so they announce themselves, and the Russians finally decide to get in on this. They're like, wait a minute. And so all of a sudden, the Ottomans and the Russians are moving. The Ottomans and Russians, longtime enemies, are like, yeah, France is our real enemy. So Russian fleet, you want to come out of the Crimea and sail over to Malta? Because the taking of Malta was a great offense to the Russian people and the Russian Tsar. And so they do that. And so now all of a sudden, the Directory is in trouble. Their boy is trapped in the Middle East because he can't get back. There's no fleet to take him back. The armies over there, those are some of the best troops that they had, the troops he fought in Italy. Well, shoot, now what do? We're in the middle of this chaos. And so it's at this moment that you start seeing Sieyès make his move. And so you have the war continuing, as I already said, and you have more European armies. There's a new coalition, and they're now coming after the French. And so once again, the nation perceives itself to be in peril. And so this is when Sieyès begins to say, I got to do something. There's one more coup, so there's three, and this one, Prairial, right here, occurs. And once again, the Jacobins. This time, the Jacobins go after the Directory leadership itself. Sieyès is there, and he's like, this is good, because I have a plan, and I need to have guys who aren't secure in their position. So if I support the Jacobins making this move, my future plan will work out well. So he's like, all right, I'm ready to make my move. And so there's this kind of going on back and forth. The French are able to raise new armies. Again, they're the ones who are creating large-scale armies. I was just doing a lecture Thursday night about the War of 1812. And the numbers of troops in these battles are usually 5,000, 3,000, 8,000. And so somebody asks, like, those are small numbers. Those are the typical numbers. The French are the ones who are changing this in this moment with what they call the levée en masse, which is basically if you're breathing, you're going to go fight. And so they're going to put out armies in the tens of thousands, eventually Napoleon, into the hundreds of thousands of troops. So they're able to get new people. They're able to kind of forestall the coming European armies. So Sayes then jumps in and makes his move. He's aided by the fact that Napoleon is able to escape the Middle East on a small ship and successfully make his way back to France. So he arrives, he plays the role of conquering hero, conveniently forgetting that his fleet had been destroyed and that he had abandoned his whole army. They didn't come with him. Some of the leaders came, but the army's stuck over there. They're not really going to play a role for a while in the story militarily. Napoleon's brother, Joseph, a couple of slides back I showed you, one of the things that occurred in one of the takeovers is that he was made what we would call the Speaker of the House. He was made the guy in charge of the largest, numerically largest, of their legislative branches. So he's there also. Sayes brings Joseph into his confidence. Here's my plan. We're going to overthrow this government, and we're going to set up a more stronger conservative government that will allow us to deal with all this chaos. But I need a popular figure who the people can rally around. I'm thinking about your brother. And I love Joseph told him straight up, dude, Napoleon's a little tough to deal with. Just be careful. If you know your Roman history, the same thing happened with Julius Caesar, where he was considered the weakest of the three in the triumvirate and was assumed by the two powerful ones they could control him. Doesn't always work out that way. Again, you can't control the forces of change once they're unleashed. So they have this plan. They bring in Talleyrand, who becomes one of the really key players in French history. He'll be the one who basically causes the XYZ affair, chaos for us. So they're going to make their move. So they do. Here's the plan. We're going to first get the legislature out of Paris. Now, if you remember, one of the things that happened early in the revolution was the Parisians demanded the king and the legislators to come away from Versailles back to Paris. There's a long story involving Louis XIV as to why they were even in Versailles, but the short version was it was to punish Paris and to weaken Paris. So when they decided in 87, 88, no, you're coming back to Paris, which they did under force, it was Paris, my character on the stage, saying, you're not going to ignore us. You're going to listen. So they controlled. That was one of the moments when many of the conservatives left the group. Some of the previous revolutionaries were like, oh, this doesn't look good. Now, Sayes is going, we have to move out of Paris so we're less likely to have any confrontation from the Parisians themselves. Oh. And then the second thing he's going to do is he's going to convince all the directors to resign. And then he's going to have Napoleon go into this group of legislators and make a speech. Now, what he's hoping is Napoleon will kind of walk in there, hey, I'm Napoleon, you all know me, I'm the victor, and make a great speech. This is really Napoleon's first time on stage in a public way, and he fails. Apparently, it's not easy to make public speeches, particularly under pressure in a political arena, and so he did not do well in the story. And much like Robespierre experienced, members of the legislature basically stood up and attacked him as too strong. But they did get physical in their sense of saying, no, you're not going to do this. In the process, Napoleon gets hit, gets a little scratch, has a little blood. He leaves. His brother uses this to go to his soldiers who are outside the room and goes, Napoleon was attacked! Look, he's bleeding! Blood on my hand! Oh my gosh! So they go into the room and basically put everybody under martial law, threat of death from us soldiers who are protecting our boy. And with that one fell swoop, Sayes pulled off the change that he wanted, and he writes yet another constitution that will reestablish a new version. It's going to be moving us even further the other direction from where the revolutionaries were going to go. This time they really lean into the Roman Republic because they call the leaders the consuls. So the Romans had 2. The French said, hey, we should go for 3. So there's always kind of a tiebreaker in all of our decisions. But as they're writing this document, Napoleon himself gets involved. So it turns out maybe he's not a great speaker, although he'll get better as the time goes by. But he was somebody who was actually quite brilliant and had some views about governance, about how to control society, about changes to make in society. So even though Sayes goes into this assuming I will be able to write a document in which I, the one who has been here from the beginning with a very balanced view of how governance could work, who was a very moderate man, will kind of shepherd us out of this chaos into some stability. He gets outmaneuvered in the writing of it to where in the document itself it clearly states that the first consul will have the most power. So no longer three kind of working together, but three at the beck and call to the one. And in the document it says Napoleon will be the first consul. So it'd be like if we had written the Constitution and said we'll have a president and it will be George Washington, and not put it to a vote. We'll just say it's George Washington because that's who we want. But it's not who the people wanted. It was who Napoleon wanted. So all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, Napoleon takes over. And so now we've come really all the way back to where Napoleon takes over the consulate and will serve as the first consul. And this Constitution will basically set up a version of our republic, but now you've actually got a little more conservative. They will have universal male suffrage. So again, it sounds like they could say, hey, democracy, but it's all an illusion because you didn't vote directly for anybody. Remember when we set ours up, the House of Representatives was the people's house. That was meant to be the one place for the people's voice, which is why the budget in our Constitution, our Congress hadn't done this in a long time, but it's why the budget in our Constitution is meant to be run exclusively by the House, because that's the one place you and I get to vote on who's up there for the shortest amount of time, 2 freaking years. You screw up, I know where you live. So you're coming back. Don't mess up with our money. That's our idea of it. They didn't even have that. It's a very torturous way of voting that, again, basically nobody voted in any of the elections that were held. But they won't get to vote for very long because Napoleon's basically going to make his move. And so here you can see kind of the full list. This is where we're going to end it from a sense of the list. Although, as I'll show you in a second, a quick slide, there's a few more things happening with Napoleon that will kind of take us forward. Napoleon will be the one who kind of takes control of the whole story. They will put it to a vote. Now, I know the number sounds big. And if you Google it, you'll be told that over 4 million people voted. Historians now know that's a complete fabrication, that Joseph and Napoleon basically cheated, just wrote down fake numbers. But there are somewhere, and it was an overwhelming election, right? So it wasn't like it was close. 1.5 million, about 1,500 against. So that sounds like, oh, a lot, until you realize that's about 10% of the electorate. It's always important, to me at least, when you look at election results and you see media flashing around percentages of things, for you to ask, wait, how many people actually voted? If you have 50% or 60% of 30% of the people, okay, groovy, you got 60% of that 30%, but 70% clearly did not support you. Don't run around claiming you had a mandate for something when 70% of the population has not voted for you. And you, as critical thinking citizens, ought to pay attention to that when you see any election, whether it's local, City of Winter Park, City of Orlando, or anywhere else. So remember, we've seen voting from the French nosedive down. Now, Napoleon will set in motion the peace or the normality of his system. He'll kiss and make up with the Catholic Church. Now, they won't officially be like the state religion, but they're allowed to, you can be a priest once again, we'll have a bishop, we'll kiss and make up with the Pope. He gets peace with England, the Treaty d'Amiens. Okay. It looks initially like maybe Napoleon might be the guy, but look how we've done it. How we've done it has gotten all the way to where you're back with one person having supreme power. And you see this by his next moves. Napoleon finally pulls the gloves off and says, you know what, actually, I don't really want to have this 3 thing. We're going to change it. We're going to write a new constitution and make it, I'm the first consul for life. And he's like, to heck with it. We're going to write another constitution. So again, I told you 15, 16 constitutions over the years. And this one, these numbers we're pretty sure about. So you go from a place where you have the people willing to cut off the head of the king and then openly voting for a king or an emperor. Now this raises a ton of questions, And so with the last amount of time we have, actually I'm going to stop here in a second and see for a second if you have a question about kind of the beats we've gone through.
And I want to spend the last 15 minutes or so digging into, well, what's the so what? Because I think it's useful for us, particularly as Americans, but I think it's useful for us to look at. But you get this moment, and this is a very famous story, which we don't have time, but that's the Pope right there. This is the very famous painting of David, so he might have elaborated a little bit, but in general terms, most historians believe this is great. There's the Pope. This is 1803. It's 1,003 years after the Pope placed the first crown upon the first emperor, Charlemagne. He had Charlemagne kneel in front of him, place it. Who's got the power? The man wearing the crown or the guy who can place the crown? Dude who can place the crown. The kingmaker is always more powerful, right? Charlemagne knew it. That's why he's mad at the Pope pretty much for the rest of his life. There's always a tension between the church and the state in European history when you examine that post-coming of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon's got the Pope up there on the stage. The Pope's up there looking, and he's got it situated, holding the crown. Napoleon walks up, all the pomp and circumstance, like we saw with King Charles. And then in one fell swoop, very unexpected, Napoleon stepped up on the stage and grabbed the crown from the Pope and holds it up and turns aloft to the people, just like David is showing, and places the crown. Who's got the most power? The guy wearing the crown, the guy who can place the crown. Same dude, you got all the power. So we've moved this way. War will obviously unfold. So the French Revolution just descends into this series of wars. So let me show you one more time. So here we start with the monarchy. Here's where it all begins. Conservative, liberal. Third estate now. Liberal, conservative, or maybe radical and conservative, and again the terms aren't right. Move all this way. Again, this just keeps going straight, so come out here. Keep moving. All these events happen. These wars happening. Paris Commune takes over. Crisis, thermidor reaction. Thermidor reaction will go, come on, turn the corner, and now we go all the way back. All right? Yeah. Does anybody have a question about the beats we've hit? We're going to go forward. We're not stopping yet. All right, cool. My boy John had everything to say that's worth saying about this. So when this happens, John's obviously out of power now, and he writes, he's like, look, I told you all what was going to happen. I laid this out for you. And he raises the question we're going to examine now, sort of the why. Now he gives his opinion. We'll see if we agree with him or not. But why? Why does the French Revolution not succeed at the level of the American Revolution? I think this is vital for us because, as I said earlier at the beginning, I would make an argument that many people, including, I would suggest, many Americans, many citizens of the United States, would say that the French Revolution was somehow more important to them, or more dear to them, or more loving to them, or something that they think did better, had a better influence, a better impact. And John's going, I don't think you should have that opinion. And he points out again, his little slam is, obviously he's loving of New England, so he's like, I think any other group of townsmen in New England would have come up with a better story for the French. So why does this matter for us? I'll just say this, and I'll dive into some information. As we're going forward in time, I would suggest that as the participants in the story, you and I, we're not trapped. I'm trying this thing's losing its way. We shouldn't consider ourselves trapped to the forces that happen to us, but as we're in the lab smocks of the American experiment, and we're debating, well, what beaker needs to be turned, what dial needs to be turned, and if what's upheld as the ideal is the French Revolution, it would seem as if that's not where we want to go. The American Revolution provides a much better outcome. Not just a much better, I like some American. It's like, let's just look at the history that you kind of walk your way through. One of the things I can give as an example of that, it's not about what I think, it's about what the evidence demonstrates for us. So let's look here. These are some of the things that I think are useful for us. One is the Americans had about 150 years of practice. I call it citizen government on training wheels. They still had a king. They still were officially under the parliament, but in general terms, they were in a setting where they could, in their towns and eventually their larger colonies, vote, elect, have government. They could practice. When I was younger, there was a thing called boy state. I think it still exists. And there was another thing, we called it youth legislature. And so all year long in my little club, boys said you had to be selected too, but youth ledge, you could just get into it. And we pretended to be politicians in the state of Tennessee, and we made pretend laws and rules, and then for a 4-day weekend, we all descended on Nashville. I'm sure Nashvillians got out of town because all these kids come from across the state. But we had to practice. We had to practice at the governance when we were 13, 14, 15 years of age about what it might be like if you were a legislator, if you could be the governor, if you were somebody in an official position. You practice this thing. The French had equally been considering what we call government of the people in the same time frame. Remember, what often gets held up and enshrined is the Enlightenment. And I put my cards on the table, just like some of you know how I feel about Jefferson. The Enlightenment, to be Southern about it, ain't no big deal. What's the big deal is the Renaissance. The Renaissance introduced the idea that the human has value. The Renaissance introduced the idea that the human, having had value, can choose for herself whether or not she participates in something spiritual or not. May choose to not believe there's anything up there, and she's allowed to do that. That the person having value has agency to choose what he may wish to go into for work and no longer be confined by some rules, by some aristocratic elite saying, no, you must take this job. That's the job your family has held for all these many decades and years. The Renaissance said, you can think, you can process. And if you can do those things, then the Renaissance suggested, and you begin to see it happening in some Italian city-states, well, you ought to be in a place where you can contribute in some way to a government of the people. That lends itself into England, what they do in the 1600s. But our French friends knew it too. And so there are theorists like we know of Locke and Hobbes. We just don't talk about these French theorists. And I don't want to bore you with their names now, but they were writing similar things, actually earlier than Locke and Hobbes. But then the French wars, the civil wars that were swirling around religion, sometimes basically 1540 to 1613 or so, happened. And out of that, the trifecta of Henry IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV take over. And in their method, just like we saw with Napoleon, to cause the end of social chaos, they brought all power into themselves as the governing structure. It's not fair to say they became dictators. It's them expressing, how do we have a sense of calm? Well, the American and the idea of the version of citizens of the people is say, you have calm by instructing or constructing your society on a foundation of morals and virtues that most everybody agrees to, that do not have to be necessarily religiously entwined. But you don't have it done by force in the central government. And so that's why the Americans and the British before them thought in terms of power. The question of Locke and Hobbes is a question of where do we want the power to reside. And at least early in our nation's history, it was in the people, not in the government. Now that changes for different reasons in the process. What else happened? Well, when we had our revolution, we did not jettison our understanding of law. We basically kept what we had had before, made a few small tweaks to it, and rolled forward, taking British common law into our system. The French, as we talked about, jettisoned everything. We're going to even change the names of the weeks. We're going to change how many hours there are in a day. We're changing everything. Which, groovy. Okay, sure, go for it. But just understand that much. The human as a species despises change. And some of you like me, you're old enough, you know it. Despise that. Now, sometimes change is good. Sometimes change is necessary. But I'm just saying, as a species, we don't like it. So the French introduced a ton of change in the process. Another aspect, which I won't get lost here, though, I think we're going to cover this in 2025 in one of our sessions, is this right here. The Enlightenment, people who know it, will give you Rousseau and Montesquieu and Voltaire, and those are all Europeans. They'll talk about Kant, all Europeans. And deeply ignored is the Enlightenment that was happening in Scotland. And the Scottish Enlightenment was one that believed reason and faith can coexist together. I mean, you don't have to agree with them, but that's what they believed. And they brought that to the United States. To the point that, for instance, Madison, who is the father of our Constitution, was schooled by the president of Princeton, John Witherspoon, who himself was a minister and a thinker in the Enlightenment, to say this is the right way to blend these ideas from the Renaissance. Over 1/3 of the delegates at the Second Continental Congress were Scots who had been educated in the Scottish Enlightenment system. So there's a key difference there in the process. We do have some retribution that occurs in our story. We don't let the loyalists just hang out. But there's not a terror. There's not a kind of murderous intent that kind of breaks out. There are people who are unhappy. Again, Ben Franklin, he never reconciled with his son. So there were hard feelings and broken relationships, but neither Ben nor his son tried to kill the other. So you have that difference in the story. We generally had a unified belief about government coming from our experience of 13 colonies. As I said earlier, that power is dangerous and so should be given only limitedly, I don't know if that's a word or not, but in a limited capacity to the central government or whoever is the government, including its state house. And then that power should be split into parts so that whatever's contained in this part can't get to that part. And whoever's in this part can't get to that part or that part. I think that's something that we've definitely lost in our country. But that's not what they've never seen that. That's not saying they couldn't do it, but they've never seen that. Again, we had a system, we can say 150 years, this kind of works, let's run with it. Let's tweak it a little bit, but let's run with it. The French were kind of all over the place. I like this, which is great, but it meant then the chaos that we've already talked about. We had the luxury of nature in that we were protected. This is why a lot of revolutions, say the Iraqis, what they've gone through, why it's so torturous, because they're in the middle of these other countries. We were isolated and protected. And perhaps had we been able to take France and put it up on the moon and given them oxygen, they might have worked things out and would have had a happy, ever after story, but they don't have that. And again, though, they caused a lot of that because they're the ones who brought the war on themselves. And then, of course, we avoided war. They did not. So, does the revolution fail? Well, I would say it does. And again, I'm someone who loves France, and I've spent 40 years studying the French Revolution and the French people, and I just love that whole story of what going all the way back to Charlemagne and the Gauls, actually, kind of begin our story with what that land is like. But to me, the outcome at the end is not a positive one. And I've given you some information here, just real briefly, we finish up here. Why did it do that? Some of these were already kind of mentioned. This is a biggie here. It never gave it time to work. There was also kind of, again, the zero-sum game where it got to be we're going to kill everybody who we disagree with, because that leans into our tribalness as a species. If you're worried, you think there's a lot of tribalness in America today. Well, that's kind of who we are as a species. And then once that happens to where you start killing you kill my uncle, so I'm going to kill your brother. You kill my brother, so I'm going to kill your wife. Well, you kill my, and then that tit for tat, which you can see throughout all of human history, through the ages, in all people groups. So don't lean into that, but they did. This one's a really difficult one. We don't have time to give it, but there is a difference in being able to pull off individual liberty and equity, particularly when we mean equity of outcome. And to be able you cannot have both of those things. And Adams and Jefferson had some very famous, long debates and discussions. And Jefferson was certain that he could. But in my opinion, Adams would bring the evidence from human history, and Jefferson would just kind of ignore it in the process. One more, then we're done. The economics were never solved. And we had this problem too. That's where Hamilton comes in, remember? The whole idea that Hamilton said, we need to fix our economics. And he was opposed by Jefferson and Madison, but thankfully Washington recognized, yeah, this may bring more power. We may not like a national bank, but we need to solve our economic chaos. We can't go forward economically imperiled. Well, that sounds familiar. So they never really survived it. They come close to pulling it off under Napoleon, but then he makes a fairly drastic mistake with the creation of the continental system, which then weakens their economics one more time. And then this, right? So these wars are taking the revolution throughout all of Europe, and they're kind of surprised nobody likes it. There's reasons. I think there were aspects of the ideology or the ethos of revolution against, say, dictatorial monarchy that people were like, yeah, I like that. But everything else that the French were saying had to come with it wasn't all that well received. And with that, we come back then to this, in case you didn't get this the first time. So we want to try to understand, and hopefully I've shown you to the best of my ability, how do you get there? How do you go from this moment where we reject our government, saying it's too powerful in the monarch, to then going around in little more than a decade and re-electing an election of an all-powerful, he had more power, Napoleon had more power than Louis XVI. How do you pull that off? Well, we talked about it and all the different factors, and hopefully you feel like we have gotten there. So with that, we're done. We have a few minutes. Does anybody have a question now that they would like to ask? It's totally cool if you don't. I'm going to show you the upcoming things that are coming. It's all good if you don't. I hope you will have a wonderful weekend. Going once, going twice. I'll be down here if you want to come talk to me privately. Have a great weekend.